Tonight we're welcoming Susan Seubert, and I'm thrilled to be able to announce her to you guys tonight. Susan is an award-winning photographer who works both as a fine art photographer as well as a photojournalist. Her fine art work has been shown at regional biennial exhibitions at Portland Art Museum, the Tacoma Art Museum, as well as across the nation and abroad. And Susan's also shown here at Clark at the Archer Gallery downstairs. As a journalist, she's been acknowledged by the National Geographic Society as a photography expert, and she contributes regularly to such publications as National Geographic Traveler and the New York Times. So she'll tell us a bunch more about both of the roles that she plays as a photographer, and join me in welcoming Susan Seubert.
Thank you, Censini, and thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank also Clark College for bringing me here tonight. It's an honor to be here. I always love talking to students because it's been such a long time since I was a student. And I remember how weird it was to kind of face life at 18 or 19 or, well, now 40-something. And to look at the wide world of photography when I started out in high school, I was sort of leaning towards philosophy, and I was taking my SAT classes and signing up for the SAT exam. I don't know how many of you have to do this, but we had to sort of declare a major, and I was going to be a philosophy major. And then I saw right next to philosophy was photography, and I thought to myself, no way, you can't get a degree in photography, can you? So I went down to the library and looked at the microfiche for a college where you could get a degree in photography. That ages me pretty well. There was no internet, no Google, no digital, no nothing. You had to go down to the library and do all the research yourself. And I found a school in Portland, the Pacific Northwest College of Art, which was attached to the Portland Art Museum at the time. It was one of 8 schools in the United States that offered that was attached to a museum, but also offered a degree in photography. And in a giant leap of faith, my parents, who are here tonight, hi, Mom and Dad, who I have to thank for my college education. They helped me out tremendously and were very supportive, even though an arts degree seemed, well, we don't have to go there. But so I wound up in Portland, Oregon in 1988 at PNCA, and I wanted to be a photojournalist. I thought that working in photojournalism would be a great career for me. And so when I was in school, there was a photojournalist, Joe Cantrell, who was offering extension classes, and I was studying art. We was really an art school. Your first year was the foundation class. You had to learn how to draw. You had to learn how to work in 3D design, sculpture, all the things that I was terrified of. But I ultimately think that made me sort of a better photographer, and I'll get to that a little bit later. And then as sort of time went on, I was offered an internship in New York during my senior year when I was working on my thesis program. I had started in the direction of a photojournalism project about domestic violence. I had already completed a story about the logging industry. Again, keeping in mind this is in the late 80s and early 90s, so it was a lot more difficult to gain access back then. Everything had to be shot on film, hand-processed, printed, and presented in a real analog format. And when I went to New York, I had no idea what I was going up against. I got there assuming I had internships, and I got to the West Side Y. My mom and dad were with me also then. And I sort of ended up having to find my own way. The program that I was involved in, unbeknownst to me, was in its infancy. I was the first person from the Pacific Northwest to be involved in the AICU New York Studio program, which still exists today. You can apply for it as a student, I think, anywhere now. But at the time, PNCA was not a part of the AICA, which stands for the Alliance of Independent Colleges of Art. And I sort of created that connection by virtue of getting accepted into the program. I worked with a highly conceptual artist duo named Clegg and Gutmann. They've sort of fallen off the map, but they did highly conceptual photography. I also worked at Magnum Photos. How many of you youngster students out here know what Magnum is? That's a sort of nobody. Well, Magnum at the time was the first artist cooperative in photojournalism in the world. Henri Cartier-Bresson, some of the finest, Elliot Erwitt, some of the finest photojournalists were founding members of Magnum. So it was a huge honor to be an intern there. And when I mean intern, I mean you worked for free. There was no question. You had a really strict application process. And I got in there by virtue of connections through the art museum. And I started working with a photographer named Susan Meiselas. If you're not familiar with her work and you're a photography major, I suggest that you look her up. She's sort of been a precursor to a lot of modern female photojournalism in this country and actually throughout the world. She's a Guggenheim Fellow, and she's worked in Kurdistan. She's worked in some of the most war-torn areas on Earth, and she's someone that you should know about and study. But at any rate, that was sort of a transformative experience for me to work for not only photojournalists who were out there in the world documenting the atrocities of war. James Noctaway was another person I worked with. And then also with Clegg and Gutmann, who were doing these sort of highly conceptual photographs. And I realized, I had this sort of aha moment that I could do whatever I wanted. I could merge my love of photojournalism and my love of fine art, which I had developed and sort of was encouraged by the teachers for my 3.5 years at school at that point, into making my own work. So I came back to Portland and I trashed my thesis and started completely from scratch. And I went back to the idea of doing research about domestic violence and working with a women's shelter and working with the women directly and studying by going through the library case studies of sexual predators and the behavior of that sort of thing. I was able to create a body of work that addressed these issues. So I'm going to start at the very beginning. Again, keeping in mind this is 1992-93, so everything is shot on film. And what I would do is I would make images and then I would type the text across the negative, stick it in the enlarger and make a print. These are all 40 by 60 inches. And this led to my first show in a gallery, which I got before I graduated. And that started the domino effect for the rest of my career. And I say that now because having that show, having one person, William Jameson, believe in me, allowed me to move forward as an artist. So, a lot of the text is difficult to read because it's difficult to read, meaning that it's hard, it's emotionally difficult. But all the words that I use in this work are quoted from either domestic violence, people who committed atrocities and were convicted felons, or it was through the women's shelter that I worked with, or through some of the research that I did when I was trying to, sort of deal with the idea of violence against women. So this was part of a show that I had at James and Thomas. It was also part of my thesis project that was shown at the Portland Art Museum in 1992. And so at the time, you couldn't really manipulate text. You had to use it in relationship to the actual negative. So this is an 8 by 10 negative, so the text appears smaller. And then this is a 2 by 2 inch negative that is contact printed onto a 16 by 20 inch piece of paper, and then I type the text onto a piece of acetate and put it into the enlarger. So I think in a digital world, these prints look a little different. And I don't know how many of you are photography majors, but in an analog world, this was actually quite hard to produce. This text comes from a court case where a father was convicted of raping his 2-year-old daughter, and this was his defense, literally. And that's the image. This text was taken from one of the textbooks I was reading up on sexual predators, and this guy was a case study about how he felt manipulated by women. And so what I would do oftentimes is I would find the text, and then I would go out onto the streets and sort of shoot images that I felt would sort of go along with the text. And there's the detail of the image. From that point on, and I apologize for the color, this is so it matches my website, but from there I started working with the Domestic Violence Reduction Unit with the Portland Police Department. And at the time they had file cabinets jam-packed, filled with closed cases that were public domain about men who had beaten up their wives or girlfriends. And I was very curious to see what, in my own community in Multnomah County, sort of what was the ratio of men beating up women versus women beating up men and all of that. And so the only way to really find out is to go there and read all these documents. So I spent weeks and weeks and weeks reading these documents. And there was an overwhelming majority of men beating women. And so what really struck me, though, is that while you're reading these police reports, which are written so almost callously, it's complainant and then assailant, et cetera, et cetera. And it became very repetitive. And so I decided to photograph the object that was used in each case study and then type out the text regardless of syntax so that it formed sort of a block. And again, it was difficult to read because it was difficult to read. That's something that's been used in poetry before. It's been used in a lot of other sort of text-driven artwork. And so it's something that I chose to use with this body of work. So this is just a close-up of the text, and you can get a sense. These are 4x5-inch platinum prints. I shot them with a 4x5-inch camera and then contact printed them. Each print is hand-coated, so it's fiber paper coated with the platinum material, sensitized, exposed, developed, and then rinsed, etc. I don't know if you can read the text here. If you want to hear it, does anyone want to hear it, or can you read it? So it says complainant, and I removed the names of everyone so that no one would be implicated. This is all public record, so I didn't have to, but I chose to do that. So complainant said she and assailant number 1, A1, had been living together. Tonight he started arguing with her about problems they've had in the past. He attempted to convince her that she is the reason for all of their problems. He forced her to have sex with him, and because she fears him so much, she is afraid to refuse or try to, I can't even read it myself. At one point, to leave. At one point, he threw a glass bowl at her, breaking it. He then came up behind her and hit her in the head with a rolled newspaper. The impact caused her head to hit the wall. So this was written by a police officer. And after reading sort of hundreds and hundreds of these, it became very clear that everyday objects that you find around your house were sort of turned into these weapons. So this is an electrical cord and a table lamp, a broom, and scissors, obviously. Something that sewing scissors, you think, wow, they're just there, but then they take on this sort of horrible sensibility about them when they're put into this context. So I made 25 or so of these paired images, and they were shown at how many of you are familiar with the Portland Institute for Contemporary Art? Yay! So they had their first visual arts exhibition was a photography show, and they curated me into that. Thank you, Christy Edmonds. And I was one of 2 artists from the United States. I was the only person from the Northwest represented. I was very honored by that show, and this piece was in it. So again, I think as a student, it's hard to look forward as an artist. It's really easy to look back and see how people that believe in you can sort of move you forward. That you do it yourself in the sense that you make the work, but you need people to believe in you to get it out there into a context that will help you move forward. And as people believe in you, it's sort of this self-perpetuating machine. You continue to make work. So after this body of work, I decided to look into the idea of fear as sort of a general way of thinking. And again, this is in 1995, still pre-internet. So I was down at the library looking up fear, and I came across this book called The Encyclopedia of Fears, Phobias, and Anxieties. And I sat down and started to read it, and I was sort of amazed at how many textbook phobias there were that made absolutely no sense. And then some that made perfect sense, like this guy right here, the Charlie McCarthy doll. If you walked into your bedroom at night, you'd be like, that is freaky. So again, all analog. So these are 11 by 13 inch platinum prints. I shot them with an 8 by 10 inch camera, and then each image is actually 1 inch smaller than that, so whatever, 7 by 9. And then I had a designer, Lydia Hess, make this beautiful script for me, and I made these negatives at Kinko's. And so each piece of paper had to be blocked out with Post-it note tape, painted with the platinum material, and same with the text box below, exposed using ultraviolet light, and then developed. So these are incredibly labor-intensive pieces. I think inkjet printers had just come out, and I was excited at the idea of being able to print the text because it was so difficult. You'd get these tiny black lines where the space that you would miss the ultraviolet light, and then you have to rip it up and start all over again. And platinum right now is actually really almost irresponsible to work with. It's $725 for 108 by 10 prints or something. I mean, it's just ridiculous. At the time, it was $125, so quite a bit of difference. So these, I think there were, again, I usually work in groups of about 25 to 30, so I made 25 to 30 of these. This is fear of beds, and more like a childhood fear of the monster that lives under the bed. This is the bed itself is a tiny little, like one you'd find in a dollhouse. Fear of holy objects. Part of the fun of this project for me was actually prop shopping because I could go out and buy the pieces, which I had done before for the previous body of work. Oh, yes, excuse me. Yes, okay, so this is pediophobia. Oops. So that's fear of dolls. This is clinophobia, which is fear of beds, but rather more like fear of the monster that's under the bed. CLINOPHOBIA. And these are all on my website, so you can go and look it up if you'd like. Hagiophobia, HAGIO phobia. I think you know how to spell this one. This was the most challenging one, was to find people who were willing, and again, considering the year, it was a completely different time. And I'm happy to say that we're moving a little bit in the right direction with this, in my opinion. And then fear of garlic. Allium phobia. Actually, a very good friend of mine is allergic to alliums and can relate to this. So the idea with this body of work was to sort of, I only have 45 minutes, so, and I wanted to cram kind of a lot into this, so I'm only showing a few pieces from each series. So while I was, the whole time while I'm doing this, obviously I was not making a living selling this work. I was making a living slinging pizzas at Old Town Pizza Company, downtown Portland, which I did for 6 years. And then after that, I worked in the PNCA darkroom, and I taught a non-silver process class. That didn't go very well. And then I also was working for a photographer named Robbie McLaren, who's one of the best photographers I have ever worked with in my life. He is the nicest guy. He taught me almost everything I know about photography in general, from the business end to, and he really believed in me. He hired me time and time and time again. And he's an editorial photographer. And what that means is that, as opposed to a photojournalist, which is someone who's shooting breaking news as it happens, is that you've been given a story to cover. And sometimes it is breaking news, but oftentimes the story's already been read. It's editorial. It means that someone's taken a point of view, they've written a story, and our job is to go out and complete it. And my job is to carry the bags. So that's what I did for, I can't even think, 10 years? No, 7 years I worked for him. And so it was a way to support what I didn't have to have a regular job, meaning I didn't have a 9-to-5 day in, day out. When the phone rang and he had a job, I got on the plane or I got in the car and I went with him to wherever he needed to go. And I was his support system, and which means literally like, here are the 500 pounds of lights, and carry them and set them up while I figure out what I'm going to do. And one of the assignments that I worked with him on was in the Columbia River Gorge. This was in, I have to look at my notes. I didn't put the year. the happy face killer. Is anyone here familiar with Keith Jesperson? Yeah. So this is where he got busted. Somebody found the body of Tanya Bennett at mile marker 25 on the Columbia River Gorge Highway. And what I was astonished by was the gorge is a place where I always went to get away from the city, to get away from everything. It was sort of like this bucolic landscape, this place where it's safe and there's Bambi and Thumper. I mean, this is just in my mind, of course. And here's this gruesome crime scene. And I thought, wouldn't it be, Robbie and I were sort of being like, wouldn't it be funny to do a coffee table book about like all these body dump spots? And then I thought, yeah, that's actually pretty, I think I'm going to call the sheriff's department. There's one thing about the police department that I love. They are bored. They are so bored. I mean, they have to deal with this gruesome stuff all the time, and when an artist shows up, it's like, I want to work with you. They're like, yeah, this is great. So this detective took me around the gorge for like, I don't know, 4 or 5 days, driving me around. I'm like, my tax dollars at work. And he was giving me all these stories about these things that were going on, and he was explaining to me that drug running is a big problem on Highway 84, and it all sort of bottlenecks in Troutdale, and like all the payphones at the time were bugged up along all these, interstates that ran from Mexico all the way north, and they'd hit 84 and they'd head to the coast. So here I was in the middle of this, I'm in a sting operation. This is really cool. So I took, took notes. I went back and I decided to photograph these with an 8x10 camera using Ansel Adams' zone system and all of the things I had learned in art school about landscape photography. And I decided to make silver gelatin prints. I couldn't afford anything bigger than 16x20 at the time. Now these are available larger. The Tacoma Art Museum actually recently purchased the entire suite. But so I just hung them on the wall, and then the little placard that went next to the image described what happened at each place. And I remember the night of the opening. Nobody came, 10 people maybe, and the people would walk in, they'd walk out, and every so often somebody would see a place that they recognized and be like, oh, and then they'd read what it was, and then they'd be like, oh dear. And then you'd see them go back to the beginning of the show and go from one to one, and I thought, that is amazing. They suddenly, their point of view of this image just completely did a 180-degree turnaround. So I just chose a few. I'll read you the text that accompanies each one. So mile marker 25 on the old Columbia River Gorge Highway. On January 22nd, 1990, the partially nude body of Tanya Bennett was discovered on the east side of the road. She had died from strangulation. Keith Jesperson was indicted for the murder. This is entitled Benson State Park. On October 11th, 1993, a deputy drove up on 2 suspects as they were dumping the body of Petra Johnson, an 82-year-old woman from Clark County. The suspects had apparently robbed her home. Okay, this is the worst. This is called Corbett Boat Landing. On July 15th, 1989, the body of Charles Vernon Moore was found without its head and anchored down to the bottom of the Columbia River with rope and heavy steel bars at the Corbett Boat Landing. It took 4 months to identify the body after it was discovered by an unsuspecting boater who had hit the stump of the neck. I know, gross. This one's a little bit less creepy. So Oneonta Gorge Trailhead remains discovered here, thought to be those of a Native American, were turned over to the Smithsonian Museum for identification. This is called the Pit, Larch Mountain. This is an area of Larch Mountain that has been clear-cut by automatic weapon gunfire. It is not a government-sanctioned shooting range, but an area declared so by the locals. This site is particularly eerie, not only as an area torn apart by AK-47 assault rifles, but also as the murder site from a thrill kill by a couple of the area's youth. Larch Mountain was considered by the Sheriff's Department to be, quote, lawless, and up until recently, not even the police would approach the area alone. So, and there's a few more. The title of this was called The 10 Most Popular Places to Dump a Body in the Columbia River Gorge, but it kind of got up to 15 by the time I was done. And there were places where multiple bodies were discovered over a period of time. So, moving on from that, I decided I wanted to start working in a different medium. I saw some work by a woman whose name escapes me at this time, and she was working with tintypes, and I fell in love with the medium, and I bought a kit online, and I started working with it. And I decided to do a body of work entitled Chimeras, which is like it's a multi-headed monster and all these other things, but it's basically like something that's illusory or something that you make up in your mind. And I decided to sort of take a switch away from narrative. My work at that point had been heavily driven by text and narrative, and I decided to simply make images that sort of evoked a feeling, or something that was kind of creepy or calm or not, a lot of different things. Some of the things that I would photograph with Robbie, and this is where there were always these, you can sort of look back over time, which is what's great about being a mid-career artist, is that you can look back at your work and say, wow, I really see now an intersection of the things that were going on in my life at the time, which I didn't see then, and I see it now. And one of the things Robbie would always photograph, whenever he had to photograph a woman, he'd try to get her in white near water. So I never understood that, and he never understood it, but he said it worked every time as a picture. And so this is my woman in white near water. Well, actually, in the water. And then I also decided to do a whole series of images that revolved around this funky hotel room out on Interstate Avenue, the one with all the neon. It's really gross, but that's a great setting for this sort of stuff. And all these were photographed there. The other thing I did is I snuck into Damish. And Damish was the state mental hospital down in Salem, I want to say Salem or south of Salem. It was forbidden to take pictures in there, but I snuck in as a location scout for a movie, and I lied, sorry. But, and just to document the space, it was so creepy. And this is actually the doors all had these little windows, just like in the movies where they slide in and you can look in and see in the room. And there was all these carvings, and so there's a whole bunch of images from that series as well. I just chose to show this one. So seeing all that work from me, you can understand why I would be hired to shoot for Endless Vacation magazine. Or you can rock skinny jeans after 40. So I like giving this talk to students because the thing is there's no shame in working, number one. Number two, you can be yourself, and you can take the skill set that you learn as an artist and you can apply it to doing actually pretty fun jobs. I know this all looks kind of ridiculous, but I love it. It's a part of me. I can step away from my artwork. I can get out into the real world. I get out of the studio. I get out of the art world. I get out of academia, and I get into the world of quasi-commercial. This is all editorial, keep in mind. It's not, commercial means you're actually selling something. And Luxury Spa Finder is not selling, it's talking about the beauty of the spas and that sort of thing. So, and it's fun. I mean, we had an all-girl crew for the shoot. Every girl's name started with S. And so the poor people that worked there couldn't keep any of us straight. And it was very funny. We had a good time. That's Sharon, I was Susan, we had Sarah and Stephanie. So, this is my first cover, and I won an Alfred Eisenstadt Award for this cover. I have no idea how that happened, although it was the best moment of my life. I remember getting a phone call from Life magazine, which is now kind of defunct, and they said, "Congratulations, you won an Eisenstadt Award." I was like, "What?" And they said, "Yeah, you'll probably been nominated for an award from the Columbia School of Journalism." And I'm like, "What?" And, this is after having hemmed and hawed about getting a master's degree, moving to New York, and all these things. And I remember the night that the envelope arrived in my door, I had a little slot, and I came in and I looked down, and I looked at the envelope, and I went over and I poured myself a little bit of whiskey, and I sat down and I stared at that envelope for like an hour. I finally opened it up, and they said, "Yes, you've won. Will you please come to the award ceremony in New York?" And that springboarded my career, and I've been shooting editorial ever since for such magazines as This Old House and World Literature Today. This was on the newsstands in September. What I like about this, and I mean, some people say, "Yeah, it's kind of funny or sort of weird that you do this," but this woman is amazing. She is a poet at Reed College, Samia Bashir, and she is incredible. If you're at all interested in poetry, I highly recommend that you look her up. She's very cool. She's new to the community, and this is what I like. I would never probably intersect with this woman if it weren't for the sort of other career, that these two careers that I've got going simultaneously. You need somebody to cover a failed bomb plot? You've got my phone number. Or possibly Georgia O'Keeffe's Hawaii. This is another intersection. I love Georgia O'Keeffe's work. I've admired it ever since my parents took me to the Art Institute in Chicago, where I saw an exhibit of her paintings. And to get a call from the New York Times saying, did you know that she spent time on Maui in Hana? And I thought, wow, no, and I live in Maui part-time, so we went over there on assignment for the Times, and we were able to find all of the places that she visited and photograph and sort of follow her footsteps. And that was amazing. It was fantastic. And then, of course, my most prized client, next to Travel Oregon, is my favorite client, is National Geographic Traveler. I've been working for them as of April 1st for 10 years. I'm on the masthead of the magazine, which is a tremendous honor. And I shoot anywhere from 1 to 5 feature stories for them a year. And it is a blast. I'll just leave it at that. It's really, really fun. This is the cover for the September issue of this year. It's just I keep thinking it's October. Just 2 months ago. And the next issue that comes out, the December issue, I'll have a story that I shot about Honolulu and also a story I shot about the Central California missions. So if you're out and about and you happen to see the December-January issue, I'm in there. The issue that's on the newsstands now, I shot 2 of the Travelers of the Year, which is an award that they hand out annually to people who are doing interesting things. One of them, I didn't include him in the slideshows, an interesting couple from Portland. The guy he suffers from quadriplegia, but he and his girlfriend are doing a road trip. It's called the Long Road South. You can look it up online, and I would follow them if I were you. The guy's amazing. He has a hand cycle, and she has a regular bicycle, and they're going from here to Patagonia over the course of a year. So again, being able to get out, interface with these people it's a gift, and it's a lot of work. It's sometimes a headache, but it's amazing. So I'm going to travel back in time a little bit here. So when I think it was in the year 2000, I had stopped working for Robbie. I'd won my Eisenstadt Award. I'd sort of stopped assisting. I was doing a lot of different things to try to find my way. And I had gotten this really great studio. Robbie and I set it up together. We poured all this money into it. We built a huge darkroom. Digital imaging was starting to come into play, and all these great things were going on. And then September 11th happened, and that decimated my career. It absolutely killed it. It killed both the editorial and the fine art markets for a very long period of time. And I made this series after September 11th because I was completely just speechless. I still am. I don't understand how people can be that way. Anybody. I don't know what drives them. I don't know what motivates people to drive airplanes into buildings. I don't know why I still see posts on Facebook that it was all some government conspiracy. I don't understand these things. And so the great part about being an artist is that no one can tell you what to do except you. You can be encouraged to make certain types of artwork, but I think it's important to remain true to your vision and to use your creativity in the way that you want. And whatever that means, if it means crocheting a sweater for your niece, that's great. If it means baking a pie, perfect. But for me, it's photography. So I was working in wet plate. I had this amazing studio, and I made this series called neurasthenia. Neurasthenia is described as nervous exhaustion. It was popularized in the late 1800s in England, and it was a more sort of refined form of hysteria, which was generally attributed to women in the Victorian times. Sort of a female state. But it became common at that period of time because American men were having a very difficult sort of emotional time becoming successful capitalists. I mean, you think about it, it was during the Industrial Revolution. They were trying to go from farmers to capitalists. So I named this as a struggle for men because I really think that whole thing was driven by some sort of weird masculinity. These are 16 by 20 inch tintypes. I photographed my model using a Type 55 Polaroid, which is now no longer in existence. And then I made big 16 by 20 transparencies and printed them onto dry plate tintypes. This is still stuff you can do today. This is in the collection of, no, for heaven's sakes, Bill, help me out here, Rebecca. He just had a big book published. Yeah, Bill Hunt, thank you. So he collects, that's the other thing, collectors are really great. Bill Hunt collects pictures of people without eyes, and it can mean a number of things. So he bought this, I went to his gallery, Hosted Hunt, at the time, and we had a nice long 45-minute discussion, and I showed him this piece, and he bought it without ever seeing the actual piece. It was a printed thing, and I just was like, that's great. I mean, that's the other thing. It pays to sort of go out into the world and not live so much inside your studio or live inside yourself. It pays to go out, call the places you want to go. Don't aim low, aim high. Yeah, totally. Because once you get up there, there's only one way, it's down. So that's the part from neurasthenia, and that sort of expanded a little bit as well. So I lost my studio and I moved home. When I moved home, I didn't have a place to shoot, and I didn't have anything, so I decided to look at rayograms. My husband had a photography gallery for many years in Portland, and so we have a really marvelous book collection. And one of the things I like to do is just sit down and flip through a book. The internet has all these like pop-ups and things moving and all that, and there's something very quiet about looking through books. And I remember looking at Man Ray's rayograms and thinking, I could make photograms with a dry plate tintype. And I had seen this beautiful picture, a daguerreotype made by Adam Fuss, or Fuss, I don't know how to say his last name, but so I went on eBay and I started buying all these dresses. And I did a series of dressograms. And the size of the dress determine the size of the plate. These are all 16 by 20 plates. And they have these this was the first plate I pulled, this one right here. And it's really hard to get the coating on the plate. You're like doing this funny dance, and it's hardening in certain places, and it takes a while to get a nice even coating on these things. But what I liked about it, I mean, there's all sorts of ways you can look at this. Sort of the opening in the back is kind of vaginal, and then you see through the flowers, and then it's got this ghostly appearance. So I named this series Memento Mori, which means remember thy mortality, which of course was sort of also tying into what I was thinking about at the time of being involved in, not being involved with it, being on, terrorist attacks. When is it going to happen? I fly all the time. Who knows? So this body of work really sort of addressed a lot of those issues, femininity and playing with dolls as a child and those sorts of things. And then Abu Ghraib happened, which was another terrible thing. And so I had been asked to do a proposition for an installation at the Sheehan Gallery, which is in Walla Walla, Washington. And so this piece is entitled 100 Cheerleaders. And I'm just going to read this because I have a hard time putting it into my own words. 100 Cheerleaders is an ironic reference to the defense in the trial of Charles Grainer, the convicted Abu Ghraib prison ringleader. Grainer's attorney, Mr. Guy Womack, claimed that, quote, using naked and hooded detainees to make a human pyramid was much like what cheerleaders all over America do at football games, and putting naked prisoners on leashes was much like what parents do with their toddlers. Mr. Womack was also quoted as saying, quote, in Texas, we lasso them and drag them out of there. Mr. Grainer was quoted as saying, quote, the Christian in me knows it was wrong, but the corrections officer in me couldn't resist making a man urinate on himself. This installation was intended to provide a place and point to contemplate these conditions and to be faced with the uneasiness of a confrontation by a person who cannot see the viewer. So I printed out the famous image of the man standing on the box with a hood, and I went to OMSI and bought the Visible Man. Have you guys ever seen that? The transparent man, and you see all the So, because I needed something that light could pass through. And I printed out at Kinko's a size that would fit a 16 by 20 plate, and then I cut muslin and fashioned something that would mimic, that would make this basically an identifiable, iconic image without making a photograph of it. And made 100 of them, which took forever. But it's easily installed in different ways, and it's been installed in several different galleries over time. And if and when I sell them, I donate some of the proceeds to charity. So I took a little break after that. That was in, I can't remember when. And the next show, I sort of got tired of working with tintypes, and I decided to branch out a little bit. So I took an encaustic workshop, and I started making some color prints. I started sort of branching out a little bit. And then I took a class at Oregon College of Arts and Crafts on wet plate collodion, and then I fell back in love with these things. But I started out making encaustic prints. I wanted to start marrying sort of all the new technology I was learning as a photographer. I was learning all the digital stuff, taking classes on, processing and printing and all those things that you do digitally that you guys are now all learning as probably your basis for photography. And so I built myself a small studio, and I started photographing things, and I made a show called Science Fiction. And so I could sort of investigate ideas about decay, preservation, science, collecting, architecture, destruction, construction, things like that. And I chose so I found this guy on the street, poor guy, but it's sort of like the snake eating its tail, that reference in art history. And then this is an image about density. So the density of the water allows an egg to float, be suspended, or sink to the bottom. And this has been a very popular image, rock, paper, scissors, but it's about the random sort of quality of life. That might be a stretch for some, but for me, I kind of like the picture. So the wet plate collodion process, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar, is seeing a revival now. It's very popular. And basically what you do is you use gun cotton dissolved in ether. You pour it onto a glass plate. In this case, these are 8 by 10 inches. And then as soon as that sets up, it looks kind of like Jell-O. So how many of you know why photography was originally called the dark arts? Do you think it was because we were all creepy? I mean, you might think I am after looking at all this. No. Close. No, it was before color was even really thought of that much. But it was because silver halide crystals, when they attach to an organic material, turn black. We're not all freaky. Our fingers just get stained. So the dark arts. So you take this and then you turn off the lights. As soon as you see it set up, looks like Jell-O. Stick it in your silver bath. Let the silver adhere to the glass. It basically is not adhering to the glass, it's adhering to that collodion. And then in the 1850s, where you see all the Civil War photographs, they were all made using this method. This is before dry plate tintypes, which is what I was working with before. You pop it into a film holder or whatever you have, a wet glass plate holder, put it in the camera. I use really high-powered old-fashioned speedotron packs, and just bam! You can feel like the wind, hitting because they're very, very slow. It's like F4, like ASA 1 or something. I mean, it's a really, really slow process. It's why sometimes if you go to thrift stores and you see people, their eyes are like wide open because they're trying to sit still for a minute and a half, or their eyes are kind of ghosted, they've blinked during the exposure. It's a very slow process. So I had borrowed a friend of mine's collection of bird's nests and photographed them, and I kept going and going until I had 25. And this played in very well to this whole idea of construction, of how, and also our propensity to collect. I liked how each nest was built almost the same way, but it served a different purpose depending on the bird. So this is a robin's nest. And then this is the installation. And a collector actually bought the entire piece. It was the largest sale I've ever made in my life. and I love them. Thank you. But what's great is that I didn't want to break this collection up. I wanted it to live as one piece, because to me it was about this repetition. There's a pair of famous German artists, the Beschers. Yeah, I don't know if you've seen their work. They do it's not that I'm blatantly ripping them off. I'm just taking what they're doing and applying it to birds' nests in a different form. But basically, they go throughout Europe and they look for buildings that have very similar constructions. They did a very sort of post-industrial, harsh look at it, and I took, instead of doing silver gelatin prints or black and white digital, I took it and used a very organic material, which is wet plate collodion, and then these organic nests. And then what would be more fitting than to put it next to a bunch of atomic bomb pictures? So then you have destruction. This is what we as humans are really, really good at. And this is the first time I've ever worked with appropriated images, and that's a big, I don't know if you've been following the news, Richard Prince just won a huge case against a photographer for appropriating his images. You should read up on it, because Orphan Works, if you know anything about that, you should just write down Orphan Works and Google. But and Richard Prince winning the big case, because it just happened last week. But these are all our tax dollars at work. We own this, is all public domain. So I downloaded the ones I wanted off the internet, and I printed them onto this tissue paper. I really love the way that sort of softens the image, and then embedded them in encaustic wax. And my husband, who's a brilliant framer, came up with the idea of framing each one individually using hemlock, which, although it's hemlock wood, which is not related at all in any way to the hemlock that kills you, it's still sort of a nice, it still lingers there. And then he lined each frame with radioactive shielding lead. So they're these beautiful little sort of precious boxes that are full of destruction and death. And I really liked how that was juxtaposed. And they're small, too. These are only, I don't have an installation piece to show them next to each other. I don't have a picture of that, but it was interesting to see, to see the bird's nest, you sort of had to step back and look, but to see the bombs, you had to get in really close, which was sort of interesting So when you're showing, it's sort of things that you think about their scale. The next show that I had is called Restraint, and I was sitting at my computer one day, and I realized how this anonymity of the internet allows you to just say whatever you want, do whatever you want without any real form of restraint. You don't have to identify yourselves. You can just go off and yell and blah, 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 blah. And what is that doing to us, really? I mean, how is that dialogue healthy? I don't know. So I thought, I'm going to look at that word restraint, and I'm going to make a whole bunch of pictures about them. So I chose just 5 images to show you. Again, this involved a lot of eBay shopping. But when you start looking at the word restraint, these are oddly from Damish. These are human restraints. This is a trap that trappers set out in the woods when they want to trap a coyote. It's the foot leg hold trap. These are slave cuffs from slavery, like people being. And then this is a straitjacket, and then corset. So I like the idea that these are the ones that you don't have any choice. These are the ones where we have a choice. We had a choice, in a way. And then this one was sort of, where's the choice? Is it the religious? Is it, so just sort of trying to look at restraint in all these different ways. And just trying to, again, using images as a way to think, to meditate about a word, and to meditate sort of almost about a way of thinking about how you're going to interface with the world online. And then I took a totally different direction. I decided to do a piece called The Digital Divide. This was in the Disjective Biennial in 2012. And I don't know how many of you saw this, if any. I know one person who saw it. But so I'm going to read my little artist statement and show you the installation. But The Digital Divide, here I departed from my long-standing practice of working with antiquated processes and created a site-specific piece for Disjective's 2012 biennial. Semaphore signal videos installed on the internet, transmitted to the viewer via QR codes. And if you have a smartphone, you can actually scan this right now. and it'll take you to a video of me looking funny. The semaphore signal videos installed on the internet, transmitted to the viewer via QR codes, emphasizes the digital divide that is currently prevailing, I think, in our global culture. Working on the assumption that most viewers of this piece will not be able to read the semaphore signals as letters, which form a sentence relevant to each location where the video was made, and that there will also be a number of viewers who will not have the relevant technology to read the QR codes, the piece will have effectively alienated the viewer from at least one critical portion of the piece, therefore encompassing both ends of the digital divide. So these were just made at the copy thing. This is the installation at Disjecta. And that's me. Man down. So each location had a sentence. And when you go and see the videos of each one, it'll talk about, so you have petroleum, you have wind power, and then nature. So each one had a message. And then if you went back to the installation, so the 5 big ones were the videos, and the 5 small ones actually told you the text, so you didn't have to be completely alienated. If you could scan it, look at the video, and then scan the little ones, you could actually understand what sentence I was quickly flagging out. That is a workout. I think we should start that. Portlandia hasn't done that yet, have they? So they should. So this is the last piece I'm going to talk about. This is the first time where a magazine has commissioned something based on my fine artwork. This is currently on the newsstands. It's called Smithsonian 101 Objects That Made America. I was one of 7 photographers from across the United States asked to be part of this project. Dan Winters, David Burnett, the guy I always forget his name, but he's a really famous fashion photographer, Albert Watson. They were all included in this project. And so I was given the segment called America in the World. So these are the spreads, and it was amazing. I had to take the digital technology that I know and marry it in the studio with the wet plate collodion, because I was not allowed to bring ether and collodion and all that stuff into the Smithsonian museums where I worked. So it was the first time I had this major challenge. This map is from 1532. It's the oldest object. The object spanned 5 centuries. So this was based on tales from Christopher Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci. It depicts the world as round, which was very new at that time. And South America takes up most of the hemisphere. And Cuba, if you notice there in the picture, is where North America lies. This is the youngest object. I think you know where this is from. This is from the 102nd floor of one of the towers. They're not sure which, because it was taken from the dump site where they went to look for human remains. This is from Fort Wayne, Indiana, a nuclear fallout shelter from the 50s, where you should be able to survive in the event of a nuclear disaster. This was a watch taken from the body of a postman on the Titanic. This is a gas mask from World War I. So, lessons learned here: you can photograph chickens, or Beaujolais wine country in France. Either way, it's a wonderful life. Thank you. Are there any questions? Oh, good. Oh, one.
How is it that around the frame it has that sort of quality?
On the ambrotypes?
Yeah.
So you'll notice in a lot of them, and you'll see this if you go look for one in a thrift store, you have to call it what's flowing the plate. So you pour the collodion on and you kind of do this, and oftentimes the collodion doesn't get to all the way to the edge of the glass, and you'll often see a thumbprint in the corner. And I'm not that good at making. If you go to the museum and you look at Carlton Watkins' mammoth plates, you'll see that he was very good at flowing the plates. I'm not so good, but I actually kind of like all the development stuff that happens like that. So, yeah. Yes?
How did your childhood affect your current career choice?
Mom?
How did your childhood affect your current career choice?
I don't I had a great childhood. I grew up in Indiana, and I worked a lot. My father is a retired nuclear physics professor. My mom is a master's degree in Russian and is a retired attorney. They both are master musicians. So I don't know. You can't really top that. Maybe that's what I did. I had to go for art because everything else was taken. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah. Oh, no.
So I kind of have a question tying in with that, but it's more of the domestic violence thing that you chose, that path. One, how did you choose to do that? And then two, how did you compose yourself when you're reading and photographing all of those really touchy, heavy subjects?
Yeah, that's an interesting. The question is about domestic violence and how I approached it that way, I think. So I think that as a woman, domestic violence touches you at some point in your life. Regardless if it's somebody hollering at you when you're walking down the street. Of course it happens, all that sort of stuff. As a woman, you age out really a lot faster in photography than men do. It's just a fact. I wish it weren't true, but it is. There's a lot of those issues. But at the time, I knew a lot of women who were suffering from it. I had a friend whose grandmother was raped and left for dead while I was in college. And a lot of just really horrible things that were happening around me. And because I was raised in a very socially conscious household. My mom speaks Russian. But no, it's one of those things. I grew up in the inner city. I grew up surrounded by a lot of violent things. I wasn't in a violent environment myself, but I think that it was just, I thought that was a really important thing to investigate. Donna Ferrato had started working at that time. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work. And when I started photographing, I volunteered at a shelter and talking to these women. This one woman had her feet nailed to the floor because her boyfriend didn't want her to leave the house. Just stuff that you just can't even imagine how that can even, how does that, so yeah, it's one of those things where I think that if you really believe that something needs to be investigated or brought out into the open or talked about so that we can maybe prevent just one instance of it. Maybe I did a couple of installations down at the police department downtown in their windows down below the prison. Maybe somebody sees that and it gives them enough strength to walk away from that situation or run or something. Yeah, to leave, to seek help in the shelter. It was really emotional. And that's when I decided I didn't want to document these women. I'd photographed in the shelter and photographed the women, and I thought, these women have been used enough. I really took issue with the idea of using photojournalism and using these women at the same time. Although, I know that there's a place for that. I know that, and I understand that intellectually, but for me, I couldn't do that. I had to sort of step back from that. And I had to I couldn't say, I'm looking at this from a completely objective point of view. I'm not. I'm saying it's wrong, and it's really, really wrong, and it needs to stop. And so I was sort of tired of seeing that sort of proclaimed objectivity. There's no such thing as that in my estimation. So taking it in that direction allowed me to get out of that photojournalistic, tradition of making images. Yeah. Hope that answers your question. Good. All right. Yeah.
What else do you do with your time when you're not taking photos to find things off?
Surf. Sleep. I used to ski a lot more. I took up surfing, and so I spend a lot more time surfing now in Hawaii. Yeah, I just got back from 2 weeks of it, and or 2 months. It was great. It's nice to kind of take some time off from brainy things, and I really like surfing. My husband's a surfer, and I like warm weather and sunshine. Yeah. So yeah. But I do spend a lot of time taking pictures, even when I take a lot of pictures. So, yeah. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Have a good night. Thank you.